me a chance to talk to some fun students. Yep.
They've had a blast so far. We've had some pretty good experiences with these kids.
Good.
Transitioning
I'm
to
happy
the
to
digital.
hear it.
The live stream started.
Okay. Very cool. Then we can go ahead and get started. So hello, everyone. My name is Jared Remenar. I'm the Secretary General here of Central Texas Model UN. And with me today, I have Dr. Michael Mosser. So I will go ahead and introduce him a little bit and then let him introduce himself just a little bit. So a lot of you guys do not know, but Dr. Michael Mosser is an assistant professor of instruction here at the Department of Government at UT, and also in the International Relations and Global Studies major. He's the assistant director of the Center for European Studies. And along with that, he's a seminar leader for the IRG capstone course in international security. He teaches courses in like a range of subjects here at UT, from European security to European environmental politics to comparative politics to like security classes. And his current research interests involve studying the changing security functions of the European Union military staff, or the EUMS, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or the OSCE, within the evolving European security architecture. As an also editorial note, Dr. Michael Mosser is a professor that I've taken a slew of classes with. It has been one of my favorite professors here at UT, and most students who take classes with him share that same sentiment. So he's one of the best we have here at UT, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So Dr. Mosser, would you like to say hello?
Yeah, thank you, Jared, for that great introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation and to hear from the delegates. Some great questions I'm sure are going to be coming in.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a few questions that we are going to go ahead and use to start out this conversation. But to the delegates, just like you guys did in our first breakout session between Dr. Michael Anderson and Nick Eastwood, if you guys have questions over the course of this conversation, please feel free to ask them in the YouTube live stream chat. Those were excellent in breakout session 1, and we are more than happy to guide this discussion however you guys see fit over the course of this hour. But the first things first that we'd like to start this conversation off with is sort of about the state of America in the world today. So one of the dominant threads in the study of international relations the past couple of years has been the rise of isolationism, the rise of populism, the rise of nationalism, and now one of the more popular commentaries is that sort of wave is receding a little bit. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that it is actually receding? Do you think it's left some sort of indelible mark on political system around the world, or do you think that we're seeing a reversal to like a pre-2016 era?
Great question. I think just in the last few hours, we've had a lot of folks who have said, okay, the previous era is over, and we go back to the way things were, sort of 2008 to 2016. And I think that's way early to make that call. There was a strand in American politics that was already, I don't want to go so far as to say isolationist, but there was a strand in American politics that was pretty strongly unilateralist, as you saw in the Bush administration. And that strain didn't really go away. If anything, it was really amplified and magnified in the Trump administration. And you could argue that the Biden administration possibly upcoming here, and the Obama administration in between the Bush and Trump years was a kind of maybe like a sort of high watermark of kind of American liberalism in the 21st century, and the pushback that we saw in the institutions of American government to the kind of multilateral approach that the Obama administration brought. I don't think that pushback is going to go away. I expect that, sort of in a potential Biden administration here in January, that pushback, because now there's, sort of 4 years of institutional support for that pushback. So sort of President-elect Biden will have a great difficulty rebuilding some of the bridges that have been pretty thoroughly damaged by the Trump administration on purpose, actually. I mean, this wasn't anything accidental. This was an entirely different way of looking at the world. But I do want to say that it's not entirely just the Trump administration. This is basically building onto that strain that has been in the Republican Party anyway for quite a while.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you segue nice into another question that I had, which was related to the actual institutions that the United States is interacting with and pulling out of over the past 4 or 5 years. So everything from UNESCO to the World Health Organization to the Paris Climate Accords. One point that has been made by the Trump administration that has received a lot of support on both sides of the aisle actually is criticism of NATO and sort of the European security architecture from an American perspective. And I'm really interested, as an expert in European security like yourself, what is your perspective on sort of America's interaction with European security architecture, NATO's role in, shouldering their own weight with the 2% budget allocation, us, the American military umbrella protecting Europe. Do you think that that's something that's going to change in the next few years? Do you think we've seen progress on that? Do you think it's something that is even a valid criticism on the American side? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, everybody, sort of thinks about European security as NATO and NATO only, and of course, or maybe not so, of course, but there are a great many institutions in European security that work together collaboratively to sort of ensure, I suppose, European security. And some of these are hard security organizations like NATO, right? Traditional military alliance. Others are much more human security, as you mentioned in the bio. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe that I study is very heavily involved in things that we call soft security or human security, everything from human rights promotion, media freedom, to election monitoring. In fact, OSCE just had some election monitors here in the United States this last couple of weeks. There is, of course, also the European Union, which is developing its own kind of embryonic security arm. It's quite weak. It's very, very new, and it's still unclear how that's evolving. But those three collectively, and with the UN sort of in there as well, but sort of at least the three European ones are what we collectively refer to as the European security architecture. It is true that of those three, the United States plays a role in two. The US is a founding member of NATO and of the OSCE, no role to play in the European Union, but certainly 2 out of 3 implies that there is some sort of presence. The American presence on the European continent is not, sort of an exception, right? For many years in the Cold War, it was uncontroversial that the United States would shoulder the burden of defense for the Europeans via NATO. The Cold War put a lot of considerations to the side, and it was really no one can stand up to the Soviet Union except for the Americans, and so do whatever is necessary to protect Europe. And of course, when the Cold War ended, which is a long time ago now, right? I mean, we're talking 30 years ago, the Cold War ended, and the discussions immediately began. What is the role of the United States in European security? Should there be a role for the United States in European security? Should Europe take more of an active role? And the crazy thing is that's 30 years and we're still asking those same questions. You're right when you pose the question, it isn't just the Trump administration that has been questioning America's role in NATO. The different, both Bush administrations, the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, all raised serious concerns with the burden that the United States sort of placed upon itself and the balance of that burden in NATO. Should military expenditures rise in the European Union countries who are members of NATO? The big difference with the Trump administration is that they kind of actively discussed America's role in NATO kind of existentially, right? Sort of, is there a purpose for NATO? This was something that was really just an academic discussion for years and years. It wasn't a policy discussion. And while it is likely that 2020 will end with America still in NATO, when a founding member and arguably the most important country in the alliance is actively questioning the role that NATO plays and the role that the US should play in European security, that leaves some pretty serious scars that are going to need to be healed in, however many years it's going to take. The discussion, I think, is a valid one, though, and many European countries have sort of, some more grudgingly than others, recognize that they do need to step up in some ways, whether that be actual budget expenditure increases or true contributions to NATO operations worldwide, or even just thinking about the ways that they could contribute to NATO in ways other than just spending money. So I think that's a valid discussion, and I do give the Trump administration credit for pushing that discussion to the fore and not just trying to have a discussion on the sidelines of other kind of UN conferences or other sorts of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And to think a little bit more deeply about that question for a second, why do you think that a lot of our European allies have been reticent to increase their military spending to the levels that we've obliged them to do in many cases? I mean, do you think that it's simply that post-Cold War, they don't believe that there is an existential threat to them that requires them to spend so much money on their military? Do you think that it is, to a certain degree, feeling that there's no obligation to do so since the United States will protect them? Do you think that it's like a lack of seriousness of American threats to like pull back any sort of military presence? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, all of the above, but it also comes down to just a fundamental difference of opinion on what security means. So the US is very, very clear that security is traditional, sort of armed security, protection, defense, right? And so when the United States looks at NATO countries and their defense expenditures and says you are not spending the 2% required of your defense budget for alliance operations, and therefore you are essentially getting a free ride, or at least you're not paying your fair share for the protection that we give you, a very transactional approach. On the surface, on the face of it, that is true. But the way the Europeans reply, and you can hear this from countries as varied as Germany and France, most of the larger European countries will say this, is that our perspective on security is not just how many tanks we're contributing and how many troops we're contributing and how many planes and, the hardware, the material that, we European countries are providing intelligence networks. We European countries are providing satellite overviews. We have given space for operations headquarters. There are NATO operations headquarters scattered throughout Europe. Germany, Italy, and Spain all have operations headquarters. All of these things are rolled into the way the Europeans consider their contributions to defense budgets, right? I mean, and not just what is the hardline number on defense spending. Some European countries, mostly Eastern European countries, the countries that are the new NATO members, the ones who are newly emerging democracies, and not to put too fine a point on it, but the ones that are closest to Russia tend to see security in a more American style way. The Baltic countries, the actual former Soviet countries that are now NATO members, the Eastern European countries, Poland, Hungary, the Czech and Slovak republics, they have a more distinctly American perspective on things. They are some of the kind of staunchest advocates of an American style security budget. So you see, and this is something that isn't often discussed, but you actually see an intra-European debate that's taking place over the role of NATO, the role of defense expenditures, and the ways in which NATO can complement the other part of the security architecture that I was talking about, and that's the European Union.
Yeah, and that's absolutely fascinating. And tying it a little bit to one of your other areas of research, which is this idea of a European military and EU military force. How do you think nations like France, which is one of the primary advocates for some sort of pan-European military, cohere the idea that we should have some sort of unified military? Europe should be a larger military presence on the world stage, while also saying to the United States and saying to their East European allies, like, hey, we don't think that for instance, Russia is the same level of threat it used to be. We think that we can provide security in lots of different ways, like you were saying, satellite images, intelligence. How do you think that those two ideas come together?
Yeah, France is interesting because France has always pursued its own path, and it's sort of European when it wants to be, and it's European when it has to be. But in many ways, it's also French. It's always France first, right? And so this goes back to de Gaulle in the 50s and 60s, and that sort of French security policy. If Europe happened to go along with French security, so much the better. But if not, no problem. We'll develop our own independent force. That goes everything with the nuclear deterrent. It goes, it's sort of just the way the French see things. They pulled out of NATO's integrated military command for a very long time. They see Europe as much more of a French area, sort of a French area of influence and not an American area of influence. So a lot of what you're seeing now with President Macron is a really interesting way to utilize European security institutions and to kind of harness European security institutions under or to, I guess if I'm going to complete the metaphor right, to the French yoke, right? So in other words, France is asking for, and in some ways sort of demanding leadership of the European, sort of the European arm of the European security architecture there, and again, this really shows a lot of tension because many European countries are pushing back hard on French attempts at exerting leadership. And it's not because they see France as too close to the United States. It's actually quite the opposite. They see France as being, as I said before, sort of a European version of the United States, that what's good for France is good for Europe. And that's a story that doesn't get a lot of play in American media. That's a story that doesn't get a lot of play in kind of international news stories. You really see it coming out in academic treatments. European scholars who are looking at European security are watching very closely to see what happens in the second half, sort of as Macron's term begins to wind down, and as Angela Merkel's term in Germany begins to wind down, as her time in Germany as Germany's leader, who has pushed pretty hard back against Macron in some ways about expanding European security, about expanding French leadership in European security. How that plays out, that dynamic is actually going to be something really interesting for the next few years.
Absolutely, and that's fascinating. You're correct. It's something that we don't think about very much from an American perspective. We don't really see much of that in the American media, but it is something that has a huge impact on, our security as Americans. Shifting a little bit into taking in some delegate questions and also broadening our scope back to sort of America's role in the world. Vicky Tsai asks a really interesting question about regaining trust from America with our European allies and our allies around the world. So obviously, the Trump administration had a lot of very strong rhetoric about, America first, as well as other countries needing to, pay their fair share, shoulder the rest of the burden, not just in security, but in a slew of issues. Beyond just the United States rejoining, for instance, the Paris Climate Accords, rejoining the World Health Organization, rejoining UNESCO, what actual logistical work do you think is involved in regaining trust as a very nebulous concept? How does that look? Is it an interpersonal, President Biden plus Angela Merkel? Is it more than that? Is there institutional aspects to that?
Great question again. Trust is, as you said, nebulous, right? I mean, trust is easily lost. Trust is very hard won and easily lost. And it's it's as much related to this concept that we can count on you when necessary, and we don't know when, but we may need you, and it would be great if you were there, right? And in this case, you being the United States, this is sort of that metaphorical conversation between Europe and the United States about what happens when we pick up the phone, who's going to be on the other end, right? Rejoining institutions is necessary, but not sufficient to rebuild American. I think it goes beyond trust. I think it goes to America's reputation in the world. And I'll put it this way, right? So America first, the Trump administration's motto of America first is not unique to the Trump administration. This is a strain that has been in American politics since George Washington's farewell address to the nation, right? 1790. So you've got this strand of American exceptionalism, isolationism, stay at home, all of these sorts of things. It goes through the 18th century or the 19th century. It goes into the 20th century. We reluctantly get involved in World War I. We come home. We fail to ratify the treaty after World War I. We end up staying home. And then we get, again, sort of reluctantly into World War II. And it is, I think, and I'm pretty sure I'm on the side of, sort of historically accurate here on this one, but I think, hundreds of years from now, the 1945 to 2016 era of American international, sort of international relations that is led by the United States, Pax Americana, call it whatever you want, that period of institution building, obviously not just the United States, the West, however broadly defined, is a part of this as well, but institution building, the United Nations, the IMF, all of the Bretton Woods institutions, development, however problematic that was, but development for the world economically and otherwise, that may be an anomaly. It may be that kind of institutionalism and multilateralism, in the way that we are now sort of saying, hooray, we're going back to multilateralism, we may not be. The norm might very well be every state for itself, or regionalism, or these sorts of things, right? So rebuilding America's reputation, it will really come down to, and rebuilding America's trust from Europe and other places, it will really come down to, do we go back and say, yeah, you know, that time that was shared by both Republican and Democratic presidents and Republican and Democratic Congresses, right? That time, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, all the way up until, again, the end of the Obama administration, where we generally agreed that the kind of institutional framework of international relations was more or less right. We could always debate the, you know, sort of underpinnings and, you know, sort of around the margins, but the framework was right. The Trump administration took a sledgehammer to that framework, and it's going to be interesting to see whether or not, you know, the new administration will be able to repair that, or if we are actually really seriously now on this road to, as I said here, possibly what might be not just the new normal, but the normal the way that it always might have been otherwise, which is at best regionalism, right? And at worst, every country for itself.
Absolutely. And I think that the events of the next, 4, 8, 12 years will be very revelatory as to the trajectory that we're on, be it, back towards this 1945 to 2016 era, or whether or not this is a, as you say, like a trajectory towards a more regional or isolated world. We're about 28 minutes past the hour now, and I'm more than happy to come back to some of these discussions of international security if the delegates in the chat would like that. You guys are asking some great questions, but I want to pivot a little bit to sort of you personally. I want to talk about your career a little bit because I think that might be of interest to some delegates. But first things first, I want to talk about something you mentioned, and I think that might be of interest to delegates, which is the OSCE and your research in particular, because speaking honestly, when I first came into your class, I had never heard of the OSCE, but it actually turns out to be like a very, very important organization. Can you talk a little bit about, what it is, what its history is, and the role that it plays? Because I think that it's something very like close to home for a lot of delegates here in the Model United Nations, but most of us has probably never even heard of it.
Sure, happy to. The OSCE, for those of you who are listening on the live stream, the OSCE is a UN recognized regional organization. So there are sort of very close ties between the United Nations and the OSCE. But I do take Jared's words pretty seriously. It is not a very well-known organization. After the United Nations, the OSCE is the second largest security organization on the planet. 57 participating states, bigger than the European Union, bigger than NATO, bigger, and again, security, right? So smaller than the World Trade Organization, but the OSCE has nothing to do with trade. But it's bigger than any of the alliances that ever were. And it was set up expressly in the Cold War as, at the time, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. And it was designed expressly to keep the Soviet Union and the Americans talking in the era of détente, right? So those of you who've got a history background, or hopefully that word is familiar to everybody in this, if you're a delegate to a Model United Nations, you should know what the word détente is. But that era of détente, the cooling off period in the Cold War in the early 1970s, was a particularly interesting time for international organizations. We began to see a lot of international arms control treaties. We began to see that the United States and the Soviet Union were less, they sort of settled into, in some ways, a kind of grudging respect, maybe, but at least not actively working to, sort of start World War III, right? And the part of that came to kind of, okay, maybe we can talk about things, was what is called the Helsinki process. So Helsinki, Finland hosted the preliminary talks that became the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. So those started in 1973, right at the sort of height of détente, and they went until 1975. And essentially you had the Soviet Union, the United States, and the various allies getting together in a conference hall to talk about everything from borders to environmental security to human rights. And that last part is really very interesting because this is the first time when the Soviet Union commits itself to talking about human rights in an international forum. And it was human rights, everything from the treatment of Jews in the Soviet Union to the treatment of dissidents in the Soviet Union to the sort of political prisoners in the Eastern European countries that were related, sort of and linked to the Soviet Union, but obviously independent countries. And the Soviets, and you may be asking yourself, well, why would the Soviets be talking about human rights in a security organization? That seems insane. There's nothing to gain from that. And you're right, if that were the only thing they were talking about. But the organization, the conference, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe was designed to allow the Soviets to bring their own, sort of interests to the table, and they wanted reification of borders. In other words, they wanted the World War II borders to stay the way they were, and an international recognition that the West would not try to change Eastern Europe's borders by force. So they come with a very traditional security mindset, and the West comes with a kind of what you could recognize kind of the proto 21st century human security mindset in this. They agree to, actually, I was going to say they agree to disagree, but they actually agree on most of the kind of things that they laid out. And in 1975, they created a document called the Helsinki Final Act that has 10 principles that essentially govern, I don't necessarily say govern the relations between European states, the United States, and the Soviet Union, but govern the dialogue that's going to take place over the next 30 years. And the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe runs from 1975 through the Cold War, all the way to the end of the Cold War, when after the Cold War ends, it institutionalizes and becomes the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in 94. But remember, I had talked about the human rights and that sort of stuff. One of the things that the West was able to do in the organization, or again, its predecessor, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, was to leverage that. The Soviet Union signs the Helsinki Final Act, the West signs the Helsinki Final Act, and when various Soviet satellite states imprisoned dissidents like Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, or Lech Wałęsa in Poland, or Andrei Sakharov in the Soviet Union, the West could say, you signed this document that said human rights actually matter, that human rights are an integral part of security. You can't, we are watching. Right now, were they immediately released just because we called them out on it? No, okay, it doesn't work that way. But again, it has kind of a moral force. And that Organization for Security, or those conferences, those sort of discussions, as long as they continued, it kept these things on the agenda. Right. And that's the most important thing, at least in the Cold War, was that the CSCE, again, the predecessor to the OSCE, kept issues on the security agenda that were not in other places like the United Nations, like the arms control treaties, that kind of thing. So all the way up until the end of the Cold War, this was its big contribution. And since the end of the Cold War, it has stuck around. You may see the OSCE pop up if you're doing research on Nagorno-Karabakh, because they have been watching the border, they have been monitoring, they have been involved in peace negotiations in Nagorno-Karabakh since the 1990s. They have been involved in, as I said before, election monitoring across the area, so all the way from Central Asia to the United States. They have been involved in promoting the cause of media freedom. Many, many political journalists in Russia have died over the years, and the OSCE keeps that in the news in a way that would be hard to do otherwise. So as an organization, it is dedicated to kind of showing how security is far more comprehensive. In fact, that's what they considered, a comprehensive interpretation of security that is far more than just military.
That's fascinating, and it's sort of this last point that you touched upon that I'd like to ask further about, which is that for a country like the Soviet Union, for a country now like Russia, that does have and has had human rights issues in the past, why would they submit themselves to a document like the Helsinki Final Act that they know can potentially then be later used against them to, as you're saying, keep discussion of the killing of dissident journalists in the news? Why would they cede power to an organization like this that they know could then give them headaches later?
Two reasons. It's not a legal document, so it's not a treaty, which means they're not bound by international law in the same way that it would be like the United Nations Treaty, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, like any of the kind of UN documents. You know, they didn't have to be ratified by any of the various signatories. So technically, OSCE members are participating states rather than member states. And the force of OSCE pronouncements is nothing more than political force, which means then that it doesn't bind the participating states to any particular course of action. So you have to be really careful of ascribing too much importance to the OSCE as, holy cow, you know, it's forcing the Soviet Union or the Russian, you know, the successor states to do something they wouldn't do otherwise. It doesn't have that kind of power. The OSCE has no power whatsoever. It has influence. But influence is not the same as power. Power is a shove, influence is a nudge, right? And so the influential kind of aspects of the OSCE are really found in, as I said before, the kind of moral suasion, right? Sort of saying to the world, you promised, you pledged to hold yourself to a higher standard and you're falling short. And we, the international community, are going to, you know, sort of call you out on this. Now, it hasn't stopped the killing of journalists in Russia. It hasn't stopped the decline of media freedom in European institutions or in European nation states, including those in Western Europe, right? It hasn't stopped anything. The OSCE doesn't have an army to go in. The OSCE is not in any way a juridical process. There's nothing it can do other than bring these, you know, actions and abuses to light. That doesn't sound like very much, and to be honest, it isn't really all that much. It would be, it's far too much to say that the OSCE can force anybody to do anything, but it is far better than nothing. That's the first point. And secondly, it does every once in a while pay off in a way where a participating state will do something that is frankly unexpected. And it, you know, the OSCE doesn't necessarily claim credit for that, but they can at least say we had maybe something to do with this change in behavior of a nation state.
Absolutely. And Danish Anwar in the chat asks a good question, which is, do you think that the sort of lack of, you know, recognition or media coverage of the OSCE is an issue either in the eyes of the OSCE or in the eyes of the human rights community? Like, do you think that organizations like this that want to have a little bit of an influence in human rights and a lot of these soft security issues, like, are actually trying to have like a larger role in the media, or do you think they sort of benefit from working behind the scenes in some ways?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that last point, because I think that's exactly right. It's the OSCE is funny. It takes kind of a perverse pride in being able to be effective without being on the front pages. It's a very small organization. There are really only 500 people who work for the organization. There are 57 countries who belong to this thing, right? The population of the OSCE is in the billions, or at least in the hundreds of millions. I have to look to see exactly how many. We are certainly in the upper hundreds of millions in terms of population, and yet there are 500 people who work for the OSCE. It's headquartered in Vienna. And there are around 2,000 people who work for the OSCE in various field operations. So very small. There is, for example, no model OSCE that I know of. That means that it's limited only it's limited to what nation states give it, right? And it can't really do much beyond raise issues. Could it do it more provocatively? Could it? No, it's not an NGO, right? And so it works with NGOs, and there are a number of NGOs, just like the United Nations works with NGOs. It's a really neat division of labor, right? So NGOs who are not bound to the political process, to the international, sort of process, to sovereign nation states. The whole point of the N in NGOs is that they exist independently of nation states. They can serve as the headline grabbers, right? I mean, think about Human Rights Watch, think about Amnesty International, think about on the environmental side, Greenpeace or Earth First or any of the big NGOs that are pushing very hard for the world to wake up and take notice of X issue. The OSCE is in this weird space between the NGO world and the IO international organizations world, because they do at the end of the day have political masters. And in this case, those political masters are the participating states that pay the budget, so they fund the organization, they send ambassador level folks to Vienna to participate. And if the OSCE pushed too hard, too fast, that would be not just bad for the organization, it could possibly ruin whatever clout it's got. It could basically ruin whatever reputation the OSCE already has. And so in this case, kind of working behind the scenes, as you phrased it at the end of your question, I think is exactly right.
That's fascinating. Absolutely. And for bringing the focus back to you a little bit, and this might be a very simple question, but one that I've had myself is, what does research into the OSCE look like? How do you do that research on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, well, I mean, and so I've never worked for the OSCE. I've never been a paid employee of any international organization. I am a PhD academic, but in a different way than some of the folks you may interact with when you get to college. Those of you who are not yet in college, I am a teaching professional. You heard Jared say that my title is Assistant Professor of Instruction, right? And that implies that I teach more than research, which is totally fine for me. That's what I love to do. This kind of thing is my bread and butter. In a way that no one else has done. And you need to give the world a little tiny chunk of something that nobody's ever really thought of. So I could always say that you know more as a PhD of a tiny little sliver than anybody else on the planet, which is actually pretty cool, but it makes you really, really boring at cocktail parties, right? Well, my tiny little sliver was international organizations, the OSCE, and even more the neutral and non-aligned states and the small states within the OSCE and the European Union. So you keep narrowing and narrowing and narrowing, and eventually you find the niche that you can do, right? And that's what got me into the OSCE scholarship. That's what started. I was very fortunate. I had a grant to go to Europe for the semester and do field work. And it was a pretty sweet gig because the archives where I did my archival research on the role of those small states in the beginnings of the OSCE, that's in Prague. The headquarters are in Vienna. So I got to spend some great, quality time in some pretty amazing cities. And then, so that was the PhD. That's, excuse me, the requirement to finish, graduate school and to get those letters after your name, right? You have to write this and it has to be approved and it has to be vetted basically as a legitimate piece of scholarly research. Since then, again, my concentration has been teaching, but I have done some research and I have published articles on the role of not just the role of the small states in the OSCE, which is what my bread and butter was, but also the way in which the OSCE has evolved its conception, the way in which security is different actually now, thanks to the OSCE. And that research really involves, for me anyway, a great deal of interviews. Right, so talking to people, you heard with the question you had or in the bio, the European Union military staff, the OSCE. These are organizations that have people who work for them, right? And they can give you the researcher information if you ask it in the right way. You obviously can't ask about classified sorts of information or anything along those lines, but there really isn't all that much that they're doing that is classified anyway. So I talk to a lot of people. I do a lot of archival research, which luckily is all online. So even now in pandemic times, you can call up an archival document and pull it out of sort of the internet and read it and do the research here. And basically, I try to put the facts that are out there, the information that's out there, it exists regardless of whether or not there's a scholar studying it. And what we try to do and what I try to do personally is turn that information into something new and the interpretation of that information into something novel that people haven't really considered yet. So that's the way, and I could argue that that's the way everybody, sort of social science does research in general. It's not just me. I'm not doing anything distinct. This is the way academic research moves forward.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. And you sort of preempted my next question in the last bit of your answer there, which is, do you think that like most social science research sort of reflects that? But because you sort of answered that, what advice would you have to the audience, the high school delegates and some of the college students listening who think they might be interested in this sort of work, think that, you know, research in the social sciences, international relations sounds cool, but aren't sure if they would actually enjoy doing what you do every day for the rest of their lives? How can they get some sort of sense of what it is you do while they're still in their undergraduate career, in high school, and so on?
Yeah, I love that question because I'm going to tell you all, everybody who's listening, don't get a PhD. And that's not because it's not an insult to your intelligence. It has nothing to do with, you're like, but it's the highest stage of that. I've got to get a bachelor's and then I'm going to get a master's and then I'm going to get a PhD because I have to keep going. Don't do it. And I'll tell you why. One, just from a purely pragmatic point of view, there aren't very many positions at universities for PhDs. I am very fortunate. I have a position where I can do what I love, which is teach at the best university in Texas, at one of the best universities in the country, let alone, and in the world. And that's pretty awesome, right? But that's the exception, not the rule. PhDs, you don't need a PhD to do research. You don't need a PhD to do work. And in fact, a PhD closes more doors than it opens. So okay, that was mighty negative and everybody's really, really down right now, right? So what I tell people is if you're really interested in doing this for a living, get a master's degree at a policy school. We have a pretty awesome one at UT called the LBJ School of Public Affairs. There are other policy schools all around the country. They often have presidents' names attached to them. Not all, but many of them have presidents' names attached to them, especially the ones that are foreign affairs oriented. So if you want to do international relations, but you want to do work, not just sit in an office and write an article that one person's going to read, if you're lucky, maybe 10 people are going to read, right? And you can, a master's degree in political or sort of public policy, international relations and public policy, that kind of thing, will be just as effective at allowing you to do the research that is really fun. I mean, I throw the word fun around a lot and a lot of y'all look at me like I'm nuts, but it is fun to like dig through this kind of stuff. But it also gives you a chance to do work that is policy relevant in a way that, and this is another something that I have written about, you're not solving academic puzzles, but rather you're solving policy problems. And that is probably better for the world than, you spending 7 years of your life getting a PhD and sitting in a university, office working on this, wow, I'm going to study the changing norms of sovereignty in, sort of post-colonial Micronesia. And I'm going to spend the next 5 years of my life writing this article or this book, and it's going to go into a library shelf and 5 people are going to read it over my lifetime. Or I'm going to get a master's degree, I'm going to go work in Washington, or I'm going to go work for a think tank, or I'm going to go to work, sort of for a corporation that needs to have, sort of analysis done for it. And I'm going to actually I'm going to sort of say, hey, should we be investing in Nigeria, right now because it's got these massive protests going on in Nigeria? Should we, and then your boss comes to you and says, okay, smart person, tell me the political upside and downside of investing in Nigeria right now, this very day, right? That's the same kind of, in my mind, pretty awesome question to be asked and a pretty great task to be given. And you don't need a PhD for that. In fact, I would say don't have a PhD for that. You'll give your boss the wrong answer. So what do? Go to college, get a great, go to the best college you can go, get the best degree. And it's not like there is a degree path where you have to get an IRG, International Relations and Global Studies, or government. Those are not necessarily the only ways to policy school. Be a music major, learn to think, go to policy school, get a great master's degree, go work for a think tank, go work for a Senate or House staffer in Washington, D.C., work for somebody here in Austin, work for wherever they are, or work for a corporation that has an international division. Shell in Houston, American Airlines in Dallas, AT&T in Dallas. They have international divisions that are as big as some countries' foreign ministries. You don't have to be a business major to do this. Be a smart person who can think critically and can answer questions in ways that impress your supervisors, and you'll do just fine. You will be an applied international relations person in a way that I am not in my career.
Well, geez, so far, you've made a pretty convincing case for why we should get a PhD. We'll be really boring at cocktail parties. We'll be read by 5 people. We'll close a bunch of doors. So I'm really glad we're getting this overview.
Exactly. Right. See, this is what I'm saying.
No, it's perfect. I think that your point about actually doing something like applicable with like a master's degree in public policy or global policy studies is super relevant, especially to the people interested in Model UN or here to talk about actual applicable solutions. And I think that that's where to sort of where our like minds go. How can we actually make change in the world? So I think that's really, really valuable to these students. As we have about 15 or so minutes left, I want to pivot once more to the actual delegates. And a lot of these people are thinking about their careers. You're talking about it already with, an MPP and MPGS. I can speak for myself, and I know several other people in college level Model UN that we come in with our IR major, and we know that we want to do the State Department. We want to become a foreign service officer, and we're going to spend, 10 years at an embassy, and then we're going to go travel the world and be an ambassador one day. I think that most IR students in college realize that might not be the only path or the best path forward. So can you talk a little bit about the careers available to people who are really passionate about international relations issues? You already talked about think tanks working in DC, but people interested in foreign policy specifically, what else is there? Broaden our horizon.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And you're right to be wary of the State Department because, not wary of the State Department, but I took a practice foreign service test many years ago. It was the hardest test I ever took in my entire life. If you can take these practice tests, it is remarkably difficult to get into the Foreign Service. And that's a good thing. In my opinion, that is exactly what you want, right? We want that. So maybe, it's aspirational for sure, but set that, sort of aside. So I've already talked about, working in areas that have international relations. What you could call them is IR adjacent fields, right? Using sort of 21st century lingo here, right? So, sort of IR adjacent would be things, as I said, firms, and they aren't necessarily even just the Fortune 100 kind of companies, but this is where I would really look for people who are interested in doing work that is, sort of real world problems that are happening on a minute by minute kind of basis. These big Fortune 100 firms that are out there in the, on the planet, and we're lucky, we've got 3, 4, depends on how many count, big cities, but we've got, at least 3 major cities in Texas that have these firms. All of them have these international divisions. And so I've already said this, but I would recommend, and again, you don't need a business degree. You don't have to go to B school for this. In fact, a lot of our former IRG, International Relations and Global Studies graduates, not as many as you might think, but because we've just started telling them to apply for jobs like this. It doesn't have to be just that, right? So Facebook, Google, the tech firms, all of these firms have international aspirations, right? Facebook is duking it out with the big Chinese firms, right now as to control of the world's information in many ways, right? If you have language skills, this is actually extraordinarily important. If you have language skills already in high school, keep them going in college. Learn languages that are not necessarily Spanish or French or the other Romance languages, not even necessarily Chinese, although again, of course, that could be really very useful. But languages that could be, that would give you a leg up in things like, hey, I need to study the importance of the Philippines and Southeast Asia to counter China's rise. If you really want to do security stuff, okay, learn Tagalog, right? Or I want to study Central Asian, I want to study the ways in which energy firms can invest in Central Asia, and whether or not those opportunities are there. Okay, learn Urdu. Yeah. These are, so language skills, analysis skills, all of this is going to happen for you in college, but I'm telling you, sort of make sure that you do this, and then cast the net wide, right? Consultancies are something that oftentimes a lot of our IRG students look at, the big 5 consulting firms, but it doesn't have to be just the big 5 consulting firms. There are a lot of people doing a lot of really interesting things. I would argue that in the 21st century, as we move deeper into the 21st century, even your mom and pop stores on the corner are going to have some kind of international connection. HEB here in Texas, Whole Foods is owned by Amazon, one of the world's largest corporations, right? Everybody's got international aspirations. Global supply chains are extraordinarily resilient. Even now during coronavirus and during the lockdowns, the global supply chains have not completely broken down. We haven't yet entered that world of regionalism I was talking about earlier, and I hope we never do. But you can be a part of, sort of studying, analyzing, giving great information to your bosses. Maybe you'll be the boss yourself. Start your own firm, right? Start your own analytical firm, whatever you want to do. But, keep the international perspective alive and, keep that first and foremost. No matter where you end up, I hope that all of you keep that international perspective, at the core of who you are, because I think you'll be a better informed citizen. And I think you'll just be a better person for understanding that we are not the only ones on the planet.
Absolutely. And I think that at this point you talk about, learning different languages, like thinking about not beyond just the Romance languages, beyond just like the big, flagship languages is really valuable. And beyond just, learning languages, for instance, what actual skills do you think are either, under advertised or like under recognized as important skills for students like us to be learning as we position ourselves towards a career in IR? Is there a huge lack of statistics skills? Is there a huge lack of knowledge about one area or another that you think should be on our radar?
2 things. The ability to communicate clearly, orally and in writing, is extraordinarily important for any position, but especially so for international relations, because not everybody, sort of has English as a first language. Not everybody has American colloquial expressions, right? So being able to express yourself, complex ideas communicated clearly, is what I pitch to a lot of the IRG students who are in my classes. Figuring out the best way to get this really complicated information across, whether that's in writing or in a presentation, this is a skill that is very much in demand, and it is a skill. So don't let anybody tell you that you can't write. You need to practice, and it is way better. And I'm talking now to the high school delegates, but to the college ones as well. This is something you need to work on all the time, constantly. You need to get feedback from peers. You need to get feedback from, your teachers in high school, your professors in college. You need to be humble. Humility is an underrated personal quality, and I know it is, but it is really important to accept criticism and to say, I accept that I can be better, please help me be better, right? So that's a kind of a character thing, not so much a skill, but still these sorts of so writing. And then the second one, you put your finger right on it, stats, applied mathematics, right? So not necessarily calculus. You're not going to be doing a lot of differential equation solving in IR, but if you go to a master's program, like I tell you, you're supposed to go to a master's program, don't do a PhD. But even if you were in a PhD program, you will be doing a lot of statistics. International relations, especially on the academic side, are big end data sets that are, despite all the issues we had on Tuesday with polling being way off, the mathematical modeling of social processes is not going away. And because international relations at the heart is a social process, it just happens to be nation states interacting instead of people, having skills that allow you to model that in a way that makes sense, big, sort of looking at hundreds of thousands of interactions of nation states since the 1648, Peace of Westphalia, that will get you a long way to saying, I can see that this has a very high correlation with this outcome. Maybe not this causes this, right? We try to stay away from causal predictions, but we say, there's a very strong likelihood that this will happen. I could say that all day long, But unless I have good, sort of statistical and analytical capabilities to back that up, I would only be taken seriously by people who are happy to just take your word for it, right? And that is not the case. So good stats and other kind of applied mathematics, which I frankly don't have. I mean, I'm happy to talk about the humility part. I am humble enough to know that there are way better people who do this than me, and that's fine. You should be that person as well, right? But I think, communicate pretty clearly. And this is something, those two things together, that will make you a very strong, that will give you the best opportunity to contribute to pushing the field forward, no matter where you end up.
Very cool. Absolutely. Keeping our eye on the time a little bit, but before we wrap up, I do want to make sure we're getting enough attention to some of the questions we're getting from our audience. And Aaliyah asked a little while ago a question related to the UN. Obviously, we're gathered here today about the United Nations. We're discussing under the forum of a model United Nations. And Aaliyah asks about the Security Council and about the relationship between permanent members and non-permanent members, and specifically how that relates to human rights. So in your opinion, do you think that a lot of these quote unquote non-permanent members are sort of being shut out of an important conversation on human rights by being, sometimes people describe it as like cornered into like a less important position on the Security Council? Do you think that's an issue within the United Nations?
I love those sorts of process questions, right? I mean, this is why you're here, to work this out, right? If you figure out that you have to blow up the Security Council metaphorically and start over again, then yeah, you're probably onto something. The permanent members of the Security Council are permanent for a reason. They won World War II. But the non-permanent members do have influence, and it's a neat segue or a circle back to what we were talking about with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The non-permanent members of the Security Council have no power whatsoever, right? They cannot, and in fact, they can't push the permanent members too far, or they'll draw the veto flag. So what power do they have? None. They have influence. So the idea behind the non-permanent members is to, if proposing something, or if trying to think of it as shaping, this is a word, one of my favorite words, right? Shaping the dialogue, shaping the resolution, shaping the conversation in a way that gets you as much as you possibly can without pushing any of the P5 over the line to throw up the veto flag, right? Obviously, it's not a veto flag, you know this, but I'm just tossing this out there, right? So you have to be really, so here, I guess my thing on the non-permanent members is that, a lot of folks just write them off, right? Sort of like, why do we even bother? The non-permanent members are just window dressing, and it's just to make the UN feel good about itself, right? I think that's unfair to the organization. I think the non-permanent members do have a role to play, and that role is influential, but that role is sort of that nudge that I was talking about before, trying to get the permanent members to this, sort of going back to the Lincoln speech that's been in the news a lot, right? The permanent members to appeal to the better angels of their nature. It's tricky and it doesn't work very often, but when it does, it's pretty awesome, right? So as you're working your way through your UN studies, look to see what resolutions pass unanimously, because that's a really interesting one to look at. But then look to see what resolutions pass with input from the non-permanent members. Not every resolution starts with the P5, right? Not every resolution ends with the P5. I mean, watch and see how far a resolution can be pushed without one of the P5, sort of saying, nope, that's it, we're done. Maybe you're not going to solve the big picture issues. There's a reason why we don't have a resolution on Syria. There's a reason why we don't have a resolution on the Rohingya. Yeah, I get that, right? And welcome to the world of the United Nations. But look at what we do have, especially on areas that are of less geostrategic importance, possibly to any of the P5. That's where the non-permanent members really do make a contribution.
Absolutely, that's fantastic. And you might be able to hear in the background the bells ringing, and I wish that we could talk for 4 or 5 hours, but the delegates unfortunately have to go eat dinner and then eventually return to their committee sessions. So at this time we will wrap up. I want to thank you very, very much, Dr. Mosser, for taking the time out of your day to come sit with us, talk with these delegates. I thought it was very informative. I learned a lot, and I hope that they did as well.
Yeah, me too. I really appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation. I wish we could do it in 3 dimensions, but I think this is a pretty great substitute. And all the credit goes to y'all at CTMUN for pulling this off. I've had the pleasure of interacting with y'all on a couple of different occasions over the years, and this will go in the books as one for the books for sure. So I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Then we'll wrap up, and hopefully in future in-person conference, we might be able to have you back. So thank you very much.
Sounds great. Thank you all.